let's get started. So my presentation is on the ethics of assisted death, weighing both the pros and cons as well as my personal opinion here at the end. Now, moving into the introduction, I want you to take a second to just reminisce on your own life and some of the ethics and morals that you have, and like, what do they mean to you? What do the lives of others mean to you? You know, we all come back to that same value of life and what that means to you and to others. And my next question is, could you take the life of someone you love if they are in immense, unending pain? So if you go to the hospital and see your mother or maybe your grandparents and they're just in this agonizing pain, could you bring yourself to the point of ending their life early if that's what they want? And next, could you ask a doctor to take your life if it's you, or if you yourself were in immense, unending pain? Could you do that? Could you bring yourself to ask someone else to be the person to take your life? That's a lot to ask for someone. That's asking a lot, especially if somebody believes differently or are religious and believe that's murder. And we'll get into that a little bit further as to what physicians have to face when they're asked with such a tough question. So looking at the pros for assisted death, we have physicians' job to aid their patients up until their death, even if that means easing their pain. Now that's a controversial question in and of itself, but for most physicians and for most institutions, they see it as the doctors' and nurses' job to aid their patients, because that's their job to begin with, is to help these people medically, physically, and all of the above, mentally. But then there's financial pressures on the family for medical bills. Now, in an article that I attached here in my references, it talked about poverty and how here in Canada we don't face as many of those issues, but in the United States they face a lot of backlash when it comes to universal health care that they don't have. So for instance, if you break your leg and you go to the hospital, that's going to cost you thousands in medical bills in most cases. But what happens when you get to the point where you are in the hospital for who knows how long, on who knows how many machines keeping you alive, and are in pain regardless of how many pills or how many medications you're on, or for the life of another, how many they're on. Now, in most cases, people will ask their family to end their life early because they don't want such a medical bill being sent to their family to weigh them down for who knows how long. Endless debt of constantly paying for someone that doesn't even exist anymore because they chose to go through with it. But at least if you end their life a little earlier, then, the bill won't be as much. Next, we have patients wishes to die earlier because they're ready to go and wish to move on. Now, some patients are at the point where they're ready to go and they're asking the doctor to finish their life earlier because maybe they don't have family, maybe they don't have people to come and see them, and they've gotten to the point where they're at an age where they're just, in their head they're ready to go. And who is to say that they can't do that, right? Even if they've had a psychiatric evaluation and everything is set and they're mentally okay and they're just ready. Like, we hear that all the time. If a grandparent gets to the point where they're on their last few days and they're ready to go, and that's their choice, right? Who's to stand in their way? Then we have the religious standing of moving on and living free of pain. So in a religious sense, some would argue the opposite, where taking life is morally wrong and morally wrong, and that no one should have to do such a thing. But then there are also others that believe that moving on and living a life free of pain moving on to the afterlife and living a life with God, that this form of assisted death and assisted suicide is not a sin. They believe that medically pushing someone's life to its limit and to its max is unethical, that technology now can push someone's life further than they should live. So that ending it early is what is morally right to do, because that's when they should have died, instead of remaining on said support systems to keep them living. All right, so moving on from the pros, we have the cons of assisted death. So in the cons, we have playing the role of God. And we've discussed this a few times in class when we talked about the IVF systems in laboratories, in like fertilization and all those other issues that have popped up in class. We talked about the term playing God. Now, in assisted death, many would see it as an act of God to take the life of another, because ultimately, how is that not murder, right? Like we see that as a heinous act, but where others on the pro side would say that we're doing them a favor. So the cons for most is that factor. So terminating someone's life unconsciously in some cases. So you hear the cases of people that are conscious and know what they want. And then there's also the cases where the family has to decide for an unconscious patient who's stuck in the hospital on life support. Now, how do you make a decision? Like, how does a family come to that point of making the decision? Well, many in the con side, of course, would say that it's straight up murder, and that's why it's an issue, because it's terminating someone's life, that they're not conscious to make such a decision. Or maybe it's at the point where they should have died a long time ago, but because of the medical advances, they're being kept alive, and their life, according to the government, is one thing, and God sees it as something else. Excuse me. So, intentional euthanasia is in religious standing murder. And I've come back to this time and time again, because that is the overlying factor of absolutely all the cons, is that it's straight murder. However, the government and the law sees it otherwise. But morally and ethically, for most religious people, it is murder, because you're taking the life of another and you're playing God, going back to the first point. And life is a gift from God. That's highlighted several times throughout my paper in the religious marks from a couple of the theologians that I referenced, as well as in the book by Geisler Norman on page 162, I believe, if you guys want to look that up on euthanasia. He describes it as a gift from God. Technology pushing the life too far to the point and playing God as well. I kind of mentioned that earlier as well. So technology getting to the point where we have such advanced life support systems that we can push someone's life further and longer than most would deem, ethical, to the point where they're unconscious, yet still their heart is pumping because of a machine. And many would see that as an issue. Excuse me. Moving on, we have my own personal opinion. And I chose this topic because I do have a strong personal opinion. Like in the first point, I have a firm standing against assisted suicide and against assisted death. But as I read through Geisler's take in euthanasia and assisted suicide, we have to take responsibility for the life that is given to us, as it is a gift from God. And the fact that he keeps on talking about how life is not meaningless. God has given it to us as a gift, and we need to use such a gift to reach others and to make it worthwhile, so that we're bringing others to Christ. That's the whole meaning. And even if you're at a point in your life where you're on life support, or whether you're conscious and at the point where you can make such a decision of ending your life early, you still have purpose, and you are here until you die, until God takes you. So you have that purpose to reach others and bring them to Christ. You can tell your story. It's endless possibilities with media and technology now. You can reach anyone from anywhere. So to say that you can't is a lie. So every life has value no matter what. And that goes back to the first point when I started my presentation, is where do you place value on life? Life has immense value. And if you read my paper, I described it as what happens if a homeless man is on life support versus the President of the United States. Where do we place the value of life? Is it on occupation? Because what if a homeless man doesn't have an occupation, but yet the President of the United States is the President of the United States, right? So we place value of life on occupation, maybe what we own. All those different factors have something to play, especially when it comes in to assisted suicide and assisted death. So taking a life is squandering the time that God has given you to live and be fruitful. Now in the Bible, most of us know that it talks about us being fruitful, talks about us being fruitful and reaching out to others, like I described before. Regardless of pain and suffering, we must press on to continue to make a difference until God decides that is our time to come home. Now, the fact that we're pushing our life further than it must go is something that I feel is unethical, that I think we want so much. It's more of a want than a need for someone to stay on life support unconsciously and not be present. In most cases, if they're on said machines in this later stage of life and there is no comeback and there is no way to be treated, and the doctor gives a time where they know they can't be treated, then God needs to make the decision when you need to come home or go, end your life, and not technology and how far we're pushing it nowadays. And in conclusion, ethically, there's no right or wrong answer. You must search within yourself to identify your true morals before making such a decision. And that goes back to my introduction, where I asked you the question of whether you could do it or not. Is it something that you could make for a decision? And I think if we can find it within ourselves to find our own morals and our own ethics, I think that'll give us a much more broad understanding, But through reading my paper, you can see a bit of both sides. However, making a decision personally is another pathway all to itself. And in my last point, I want to express the fact of finding yourself. I had a really good friend who is a counselor in the Moncton area tell me that finding yourself is key, is key to life, because a lot of times we find ourselves in other people or find ourselves in other objects, things that we can connect ourselves with, but it's not true to you. So like you question your own morals and understandings of yourself in hopes of becoming a more aware you. So once you can find yourself, becoming a more aware you is someone that has specific morals based on religion and whatnot, or just your own morals in general, or your own ethics that you follow up through with these big and really, really tough questions. So once you find yourself and become a more aware you'll have a lot easier time making such decisions. And that's all I have. Identify the self. It's crucial for ethics and morality. That's all I have. I think I hit the 15-minute mark, so I appreciate it, and best of luck in the future. Thanks.